People always get the wrong end of the stick when I tell them that my granddad was a Nazi. I mean, of course, he was in the Leipzig branch of the Hitler Youth as a teen, joined the party when he was old enough, and in December of 1943 was drafted into the army to fight in the dying years of the war. That said, he was never really committed to all the anti-Semitic fascist ideology. In fact, just 3 years after the war, he married my grandmother, Rachel, a Polish Jew, in the same church that years earlier had hosted the Hitler Youth meetings, before crossing the border into British Germany and then across the sea to a new life in London. That said, he did have some great stories from what I grew up thinking of as the other side. He fought on the Eastern Front mainly, though never sent to the worst conflicts of the region, battles like those at Stalingrad, Kursk, and Kharkov. He met many soldiers both in the Standard Army and the Waffen-SS who had fought there, who told him their stories. Years later, he would tell those stories to an impressionable young child on his knee who would listen, enwrapped in the story, sitting on the floor of a little apartment that smelled of wood smoke and cigarettes. Grandpa passed away early last year, surrounded by his closest family. I'll always miss him. In memory, I'm going to pass on a story he himself passed on from a wounded soldier, who himself heard it from a Waffen-SS friend of him. The story of the Teufelsbrücke. The camp lay quiet as the snows fell that night. The canvas of the tent bulged inwards, pregnant, as 4 men talked angrily over a table smothered in sepia-brown maps and charts, pins marking the path they should have taken days ago. The only heat and light in the room came from a spitting naphtha lamp in the corner that cast long, dark shadows over everything. One of the men was talking with ice in his voice. "Look, I don't care about the fucking mission right now. If we don't move on tomorrow, we're all going to die. We need help!" The officer was young. Too young, perhaps, to have been promoted to Scharführer. Exasperated, he ripped off his hat and ran his hand through his blonde hair. The older man noticed his lapse in discipline. "We have our orders," one of them replied, his voice a flat monotone. "We are to hold the bridge until further orders are given. We cannot give in to the Bolsheviks." As he spoke, the pasty skin of his jaws quivered. One lock of his graying hair stuck out from under the brim of his cap. "What bridge?" the Scharführer cried, ignoring the man's higher rank of Standartenjunker. "Look at it!" He strode across the tent and threw the flap open. A blast of horrifyingly cold air forced its way into the room, but the officers did not react. The snow had paused for the moment, and through the thinning clouds, a half-moon shone fiercely. The undisturbed snow reflected the light into a pale blue sheen across the land. Just beyond the perimeter of the camp, the once lazy river was now frozen, a thin crust of ice and snow separating the air from the rushing waters beneath. Jutting up from the bright expanse were shattered pieces of masonry, charred and humbled. For 300 years that bridge stood tall, but all it took was one Pedlikov to flatten it and kill half our goddamn section as well. Look, we can't cross here, but there's another bridge just a day's travel south of here, a day and a night tops in this weather. When they know of our situation, they will send engineers to rebuild the bridge, another man said, his skin pale white from the days of cold and the oncoming illness that would be his death. He was also a higher rank than the youth. "And just what will they do when they know of our situation, Sturmführer? We haven't had radio contact in days, have we? We are on our own here. It is time to take action." "Steuermannsmatt, how long will our provisions last?" the pasty-skinned Standenjunker asked, ignoring the Scharführer. The timid, diminutive quartermaster looked up from the corner where he had been sitting quietly. He spoke with a mild, stuttering shiver. "We have food for 4 days, 6 if we start seriously rationing. Ammunition is fine, we haven't fired a single shot in weeks. The petrol is frozen solid in the trucks though. And as for the naphtha," he gestured at the spitting flame, "the tanks ran dry this evening. What is currently in the furnaces is all we have." "What about water?" the pale Sturmführer asked. The Steuermannsmatt shrugged, his unornamented lapels lifting and dropping with a futile little rustle of fabric. I couldn't say. Until now, we've been melting snow with the naphtha, but I guess we'll have to start thawing dirty water from the river. We have no choice of digging a well in these conditions. The Scharfjörður quietly looked out of the flap at the heap on the camp's edge. Wells weren't the only things that they were having difficulty with digging into the frozen, hard ground, and the pile of preserved, ice-white bodies had been steadily growing over the past few weeks. Unable to rot in the cold, their gleaming pale skin was naked where the people had harvested their clothes in an attempt to stay warm. As the steadily increasing mortality rate showed, it was a tactic that seldom worked. We have enough to survive for at least a week then. Make sure we do, Stauemannsmat. Oh, and Scharfjörður, the Standartenjunker called. The Scharfjörður turned to face. You're dismissed. Be sure to close the tent on your way out, won't you? He said mockingly, tossing the cap to the youth. Glaring at the older man, he firmly forced it onto his head and stamped out into the snow, purposefully leaving the door open. With each step, his leather boots crunched knee-deep into the icy crust. The clouds are gone now, blown away by the same fierce wind that now rattled the tent poles and sucked at the canvas, bringing 1,000 diamonds of ice stinging into his cheeks with each raging gust. With each step, his leather boots crunched knee-deep into the icy crust. The clouds had gone now, blown away by the same fierce winds that now rattled the tent poles and sucked at the canvas, bringing 1,000 diamonds of ice stinging into his cheeks with each raging gust. Scharfjörður, the officers are arschlocks, no? The youth stopped walking, glancing up from the snowbound path ahead of him, searching for the source of the voice. He didn't recognize it. Most of his men were from bigger cities, harsh in voice and temperament. The voice he had heard, though, was more sophisticated, cultured. Carefully, the officer readied his pistol. Behind you, Scharfjörður. He turned and saw a dark form standing in the shadow of a tent. Slowly, he walked towards the figure. Identify yourself, soldier! The man stepped forward into the light of the moon, and for a second, the young officer was unable to believe his eyes. With shaking, numb fingers, he had struck a match and, by the wavering, long yellow flame, looked upon the face of a dead man. Rottenführer Pfeiffer? I saw the bombs fall! I saw them drag you out of the water, lungs full of water and a belly full of shrapnel! You're dead! You can't be here! A temporary setback, the man drawled in his aristocratic tongue. Touch me, Scharfjörður, and you will see that I am here. The dead man held out one hand, and tentatively, the officer took it. The corpse was warm. Not just warm, really, but hot, near painfully so. His skin felt like as if fires were raging beneath the surface, only just held at bay by the Schafian bull of the man's skin. Terrified, the youth tore his hand away from the cadaver's grip, and noticed that the ground around the two of them was steaming, snow melting and leaving the floor a shiny quagmire of new, saturated mud. You're not real! The officer exclaimed. And yet I am, the dead man replied. His eyes still looked glassy and blind, on the edge of rotting. The Scharfjörður looked over to the towering pyramid of unburied bodies. Was it his imagination? Or did it look like a couple were missing? The glassy dead eyes followed his gaze. I am fish like you, Scharfjörður. If you look at the heap, you will not find me there. What are you? He gasped out, terror clutching around his heart like the icy, asphyxiating mantle of snow that enveloped the heap of dead men his leadership had killed. The corpse shrugged. We are legion, Scharfjörður. Dear Christ, are you the devil? The man laughed, a dry, croaking sort of laugh that sounded airless and gasped out of his mouth. On the breath, the faintest odor of dry rot was carried. The officer wrapped his hand around the well-worn grip of his automatic pistol on the holster at his hip. We may not be the devil, Scharfjörður, but we're closely related enough to him that pea-shooter you're clutching will do nothing but anger us. And we are not a group you want to anger. Now, we have a proposal for you. One that would not cost the lives of a single man in your service. Make your offer, demon, the Scharführer said. Normally, he would have wanted to talk inside, but the snows that had started to fall again melted into a thin mist of drizzle as it approached the two of them. The officer didn't take his hand off his pistol. Let's take this inside, shall we? We don't feel the cold so much, he said, reaching out of the circle of warmth and plunging his bare hand into the deep snow up to his elbow. The ground frozen from days before at his side. He never broke eye contact. But you do, he continued. The two men entered the tent. So, you will build me a bridge? The dead man nodded. We will. You have dozens of ready hosts out there that we can use. It can be done by morning. Where will the materials come from? The cadaver shrugged. It won't be a problem. And what payment do you require? My grandfather always said that when you deal with the devil, you have to pay the price. A wise man. We require a soul. The man shivered at the way the corpse uttered the word. What business have you with souls when you yourself lack one? He thought. As the man was warming up, the smell of rot was becoming far, far stronger than previously, to the point where the Scharführer began to feel a gag coming. Any soul? Any will do. We will harvest the soul of the first man to cross the bridge. But you said that this did not require the death of a single man in my service. And that is true. I believe there are 3 officers at this camp. 4. The two sat in silence for a couple of minutes. The Scharführer wondered whether the smell of Pfeiffer's reanimated body would linger in the tent after he was gone. Do I have your agreement, Scharführer? The man nodded. The officer wondered whether it was just a clever trick or true, evil magic that the corpse used to produce a pre-written contract and a quill pen, tipped with a single ruby drop of fresh blood. The officer did not sleep that night. The sounds of the dead laboring away at the edge of the river kept him away from what would have been, he had no doubt, uneasy dreams. Eventually, a rosy finger of dawnlight broke through the seam of his tent and, not bothering to clothe himself, he walked out into the snow. More snow had fallen, and the deep whiteness reached up to his thighs, soaking his thin pajamas through. The heap was gone, a little rough rectangle of bare ground with footsteps leading away. The man faltered and tripped, plunging his whole body into the snow. It sure was a fine bridge ahead of him. 3 long Roman arches crossed the water. A few broken spires from the previous structure still poked out of the ice, though the red brick of the new construction seemed entirely unrelated from the older, late medieval structure. Strangely, the ice seemed entirely smooth, unbroken, and treacherously clear. Underneath the frosty glass, the Scharführer could see the supports, where algae already seemed to have been growing for years, despite the use of the bridge. The officer had been dreading seeing the dead on his final walk out. Mercifully, they weren't there. He reached the perimeter gate and saw that the guards were still asleep. Just as well. He didn't want there to be any witness to what happened next. The smooth paving of the bridge had just the barest dusting of snow, the newly laid tarmac of modern and high quality. The man whispered one final prayer and, eyes closed, stepped onto the bridge. When his eyes opened, he was looking into the eyes of the dead, not just the eyes of Pfeiffer, but the eyes of all the dead at the camp, their flesh now sloughing off as the skin discolored and their faces drooping heavy with death. The thing controlling Pfeiffer's form smiled, and, plunging a hand into the soft flesh of Scharführer's stomach, shrieked with all the ancient anger of 1,000 demons that made up Legion. The dead fell upon the officer, fingers grasping and claws tearing. Officially, the Scharführer died of suicide by hanging. What the officers left out of the report was that the young officer had been hanged from the bridge by his own intestines, his belly torn open with the savage force and his scalp ripped off. His face was left intact, save for his lower jaw, which, by the account of the camp medic, had been bitten clean in half by human teeth. The upper mandible was missing all its teeth, and looked as if they'd been pulled out while the officer was still alive, and, worse, conscious. As it happened, his self-sacrifice was in vain. Just 2 days after, as the men trudged to what they were told was safety, 2 Petlyakov dive bombers attacked the soldiers, one of which was flown by the same pilot who had bombed the bridge days earlier, killing all but 2 men, the pasty-skinned Standartenjunker and the junior soldier. The Standartenjunker ended up killing the man to survive in the cold, planning to cannibalize him. Then he was captured, tortured, and executed by Soviet forces. To this day, the Teufelsbrücke still stands, reaching between the banks of the Tasayeva River.